Ovidius 101 Stories by Co-Evolve.
A long time ago, in the Canton province of China, there was a famous and very wealthy merchant who had an amazing ability to choose just the right person for the job in his organization. Indeed, it was said that it was just this skill which had made the merchant so successful and rich. It came about that this merchant was seeking a young man to serve as the coordinator and director of his vast fleet of ships. The job entailed tremendous responsibilities, as well as great rewards. A large number of men applied for the position. Some were skilled in accounting, some in the maritime arts, some had worked in nearly every phase of commerce. The old merchant knew how to go about selecting the right man for this complex task of coordinating and directing his fleet. As each candidate who had applied entered the merchant's offices, he was sworn to secrecy by the merchant, so that no matter what the result of the interview, the man had to agree to keep the details of what occurred there secret. The candidate was then instructed that he had to complete a certain task. The merchant next led the candidate to the rear of his office, where the wall was covered by a fine tapestry. Pulling the tapestry aside, the merchant pointed to a door of bronze, richly inlaid with silver, from which hung a huge chain and padlock. Addressing the candidate, the merchant stated that his personal treasure house lay behind that door, and that the task was for the candidate to gain entry to this storehouse of vast wealth. Further, the merchant continued, the only point of entry to be attempted was through the bronze door, and that the candidate could expect to find behind the door additional obstacles. The merchant then led the man to the center of the large office, where, resting on a small table, was a large Chinese box. Pointing to the box, the merchant simply stated that within this box the candidate might find objects which would assist him in his task. With an air of finality, the merchant warned the candidate that there was a time limit for the task, which he would not reveal until either the candidate had gained entry to the treasure house or the time had expired. So saying, the merchant turned and strode to his desk, which was placed at the opposite end of the room, and apparently occupied himself with some papers. To the merchant's disappointment, candidate after candidate followed one of two courses. Some of the candidates would ransack the entire assemblage of Chinese boxes, opening the entire collection until all of the various objects contained within, candle, matches, incense sticks, were secured. At which point the candidate would gather up the objects and carry them to the door. Selecting from the pile of objects all of the keys which were of a size and shape which suggested that they might fit the padlock, which hung on the chain on the bronze door, the candidate would frantically attempt to open the padlock, to no avail, as none of the keys would fit the lock. At this point the merchant would approach the candidate and announce in a clear, resonant voice that the time limit for the task had been exceeded. If the candidate maintained his composure at this announcement, the merchant would invite him to apply for a position as a trader for his organization. The second course of action chosen by the candidates was that as soon as the merchant had occupied himself at his desk, the candidate would open the first of the Chinese boxes, and then the second, and so forth until they had discovered the first of the keys, which was of a size and shape that suggested that it might fit the padlock hung on the chain on the bronze door. Once the candidate had secured the first of the keys, he would move quickly to the bronze door, where to his disappointment he would discover that the key failed to fit the padlock. He would then return to the Chinese boxes and open further boxes until he found a second key of the appropriate size and shape. After this procedure had been repeated several times, the merchant would approach and announce that the time limit had expired. Again, if the candidate retained his poise in the face of this announcement, the merchant would invite him to apply for a position in the organization. Only this time, he would mention the position of accountant. The merchant was about to despair when the next candidate arrived. This candidate had a different air about him. While remaining attentive and courteous in the presence of the famous merchant, he seemed to take in his surroundings with a sense of confidence. The merchant repeated his instructions and retired to his desk to await further developments. The young candidate paused for several minutes, as if repeating the instructions offered by the merchant. He then turned to the Chinese boxes, picked up the table and boxes, and carried them to the immediate vicinity of the bronze door. Arriving there, he then turned his attention to the door itself. He examined the fit of the door in the recess in the wall. He examined with great care the chain and padlock until, with a soft laugh, he planted himself firmly and, placing both hands on the bronze door, he pushed hard. To his delight, the door swung open, revealing a beautifully worked wrought iron door. Examining this new obstacle, he determined that it was indeed secured by a lock built into the door itself. Turning to the Chinese boxes, the candidate began to open the boxes, which revealed in turn a candle, matches, and the next, a key. Securing the key, the candidate turned back to the door, and again to his pleasure, the door yielded. As the door opened inward, it revealed a darkened chamber, in which the candidate could distinguish a pair of yellow eyes, which peered out of the darkness with seeming malevolence. Pulling the iron door closed with a quick, sure movement, the candidate hurried back into the room where the merchant stood watching with intense interest. The candidate hurried to a corner of the room, where he had earlier noted the presence of a long sword. He seized the weapon and hastened back to the wrought iron door. Pushing the door open cautiously, he thrust the lighted candle into the chamber, by the light of which he could see a large cobra sitting inside a cage, the door of which was standing open. Lunging forward, he used the sword to flip the door of the cage closed and secured it quickly. Striding around the cage, he drew back a large piece of finely worked silk, and his eyes fell upon treasures beyond his wildest dreams. Hearing the soft tread of a sandal behind him, the candidate turned and looked into the eyes of the merchant. Extending the sword toward the merchant, handle first, the candidate thanked the merchant for the temporary use of the sword, explaining that he would need it no longer, since he had already accomplished with it everything that he needed to accomplish. The merchant, needless to say, had found his director and coordinator, and their association was marked by supreme success.
Ovidius 101 Stories by Coevolve.